Alright, hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. We are in 2 Samuel chapter 21. Now this is an interesting chapter here, and I'm going to do a little sidebar. I normally don't do this, but I'm going to indulge myself here. Oftentimes, people, especially when it comes to the issue of slavery, there have been some people, evangelicals, who make the argument that why should reparations be paid? Because is it fair? This is their argument, that this generation should be judged to pay for past generations. Meaning, okay, yeah, we acknowledge there was slavery, but slavery is over, so why should we pay reparations for what they did? And I think this chapter is going to answer that, because justice is justice. That's why. Now, people who put forth that argument, they are disingenuous in that they don't care about justice. They don't care about the justice of God. They don't care about truth, okay? But this will answer this. This will answer that question. In other words, which I will oftentimes say that, first of all, America's sin of racism didn't end in 1865. Remember, we had a whole other 100 years that bring us all the way to 1965. I was 5 years old when the Civil Rights Bill passed, 8 years old when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. So, I mean, America's sin, and guess what? The church's sin goes even 30 years past that most of the church's sin of racism, and that's a mouthful itself, the most of the sin of racism, okay, they wouldn't repent for that until like the mid-90s, some of the major denominations. So, when we talk about, and again, I'm not going to get into that discussion. However, I am just indulging to say, here is a biblical answer to why should America pay for that? Or let me rephrase this. How does God view this kind of justice? Is God unfair? And we're going to see that David is all of a sudden now is going to be plagued, and all of a sudden he's like, what's going on? And God is going to point to Saul, something that Saul did. And that's why I say I want to just kind of put that thought out there. However, all right, so that is where we're going to go with this. David has crushed two major rebellions, and now this happens. A plague happens, and he's wondering what's going on here. And God tells him that this is because of what Saul did, and that's amazing to that. That God is saying, hey, yeah, your predecessor committed a grave sin, and here this generation was paying for it. And so David has to rectify the sin. Okay, he has to rectify. All right, so let's get into it. 2 Samuel chapter 21. It says, during David's reign, there was a famine for 3 successive years. So David inquired of the Lord. The Lord answered, it is because of the blood shed by Saul and his family when he killed the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites were not Israelites, but rather a remnant of the Amorites. The Amorites. I'm sorry, the Amorites. I'm sorry, the more I try to correct myself, I make the pronunciations even worse. All right. He said, the Israelites had taken an oath concerning them, but Saul had tried to kill them in his zeal for the Israelites and Judah. Now, so in order to understand this thing right here, we got to go back to the time of Joshua. Now, a couple of things too before I forget this. This also reveals even more wickedness of Saul. Now, when you kind of go back and you read the narrative of Saul, it doesn't go into a lot of detail, but Saul became quite wicked, which is why God judged him and said, "I don't want his line won't continue." You have to kind of go back to the time when Joshua started conquering the land of Israel. The Gibeonites said, and this was kind of shrewd on their part, because you get into nations that realize God, the God of the Hebrews, was God. He was on Israel's side. But yet, there were nations that did not bow to this true living God. Right? So here you had Jericho that recognized this is the God of Israel who destroyed Egypt. Yet Jericho, instead of saying, okay, can we have peace? Can we have, what can we do, right? Rahab was the one, remember, who said, look, y'all's God is the true God. I want to serve him. She survived. She lived, right? And so when Jericho was conquered, right, Rahab was saved. Well, you fast forward, the Gibeonites realized the same thing. So what they did was they said, you know what, let's pretend, even though they were kind of like really like neighbors, but let's pretend that we're coming from a long distance. So they had old worn clothes, moldy bread, and they came and said, hey, we want to have a treaty of peace. And this was a mistake by Joshua and them, that instead of seeking the counsel of God, they made a treaty. And then they found out, you guys are just right next door. You go, yeah, but it's either that or, you guys were going to kill us, destroy us. So they said, okay, you're going to be our servants. You're going to be our, stone cutters. They said, cool, we live. So that was a covenant. Saul broke that covenant. And according to the law, that was a big no-no. See? And then notice he said, and Saul in his zeal broke the covenant and he killed them. All right, so now we're talking some 450 years later, around this time, right? Some 450 years later. And notice that God is holding that covenant with the Gibeonites, right? The Gibeonites, that God is holding this covenant, whom Saul violates, and now Israel is being judged. So verse 3, he asked the Gibeonites, what shall I do for you? How can I make atonement so that you will bring a blessing on the Lord's inheritance? The Gibeonites said to him, we are not asking for money from Saul or his family, and we cannot put anyone to death in Israel. Whatever you say, I will do for you, he said, David meaning. And they replied, as for the man who annihilated us and plotted to destroy us so that we would not exist within the whole territory of Israel, that 7 of his male descendants be handed over to us, so we may hang them in the presence of the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the Lord's chosen. And the king answered, I will hand them over. Now this is kind of, again, you may think, wow, these were the days that they live in, but this was, right, cruel. Now watch this now. These were the descendants of Saul. So now you can even go a step further and say, look at this. Saul Saul, his descendants could say, why am I paying for my father's sin? And notice that God is allowing this. He said, David spared Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, Saul's son Jonathan, because of the oath of the Lord that was between David and Jonathan, Saul's son. But okay, so he spared Mephibosheth. Now it's kind of interesting. There's a hint here that David still had a soft spot for him, even though David was miffed because Mephibosheth did not take the time to ally with David when he was on the run. And as I said, I personally think that was a mistake of Mephibosheth. He should have made the effort. Crawling on his lame feet, that would have went way further for him. Even more than sparing the good. Ziba was he was a wicked man. But David saw his act, okay, as an act of kindness, okay? And it was more than what Mephibosheth did. But anyway, there's a hint here that maybe there's a soft spot. And David did divide the land up after Mephibosheth said, hey, look, he lied to me and I just didn't want to be a burden, yada, 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 yada. That's how David kind of, yada, yada, whatever, But anyway, but he still spared him because he still made a covenant with Jonathan, his dearest best friend. Verse 8, but the king took Armani and Mephibosheth, who were the two sons of Rizpah. Now this is a different one, even though I know it looks like the same. Looks like the same, but they had different mothers. Okay. Different people altogether. So anyway, who were the two sons of Rizpah, daughter of Ai, had born to Saul, and the 5 sons of Merab, daughter of Saul, had born to Adriel, son of Barzillai, the Mahilite. Now remember, these names are, besides me butchering them, very common names. So a lot of times you have to identify the names by the sons of, like the son of this person. That's how you say the difference of them. Verse 9, and he handed them over to the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on the hill in the presence of the Lord. And the 7 of them died together, and they were executed in the first days of the harvest, at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, again, we may look at this and say, this is harsh and cruel. And yes, it was. In other words, we don't do it today. We have moved on, we have grown, but again, signs of the time. Okay. Verse 10, Rizpah, Ai's daughter, took sackcloth and spread it out for herself on the rock from the beginning of the harvest until the rain poured down from heaven on the bodies. She kept the birds of the sky from them by day and the wild animals by night. Now, kind of interesting because they probably should not allow them to stay overnight anyway. But verse 11, when it was reported to David what Saul's concubine Rizpah, daughter of Ai, had done, he went and got the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan from the leaders of Jabesh Gilead, and they had stolen them from the public square of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hung the bodies that day. And the Philistines killed Saul at Gilboa. David had the bones brought from there, and they gathered up the bones of Saul's family who had been hung, and buried the bones of Saul and his sons Jonathan at Zelah in the land of Benjamin, in the tomb of Saul's father Kish. They did everything the king commanded them. After this, God answered God answered prayer for the land. Now, in other words, he healed the land. Notice it talked about this was the beginning of the barley season, so God blessed the fruit. Okay. Now again, there's a lot we cannot explain. That to us it does seem barbaric. I mean, even from God's perspective, but this is something that God did, and God, again, my point is we can't give explanations where God doesn't give explanations. Verse 15. The Philistines again waged war against Israel. David went down with his soldiers, and they fought the Philistines, but David became exhausted. Now remember, David's a little older now. As I said, David could be in his 60s around this time. Okay? Verse 16. First, and certainly he's not the David of the 30s, in his 30s and his 40s, right? Verse 16. Then Benab, one of the descendants of the giants, whose bronze spear weighed about 8 pounds, and who wore new armor, intended to kill David, but Abishai, son of Zeruiah, came to his aid, struck the Philistines, and killed him. Then David's men swore to him, "You must never go out with us to battle. You must not extinguish the lamp of Israel." Now, in other words, that's their way of saying to David, "You're too old to be going out." Now, later on, we're going to get to a list of his noble warriors, and David was a noble warrior, but he's just kind of old now. That's all. His body's changed. His body's not what it used to be. Verse 18. After this, there was another battle with the Philistines at Gob. And at the same time, Sibekiah, the Hushakite, killed Sap, who was one of the descendants of the giants. Now, you'll note again that he's referring to the giants. These are the same giants from Gath. They were big guys, okay, huge guys. This is where Goliath comes from. Once again, there was battle with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan, son of Jeroboam, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath, the Gittite. Okay, now remember, Goliath of Gath was who David killed. This is Goliath, the Gittite. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. At Gath, there was still another battle. A huge man was there with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He too was descendant of the giants. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan, son of David's brother, Shemiah, killed him. These 4 were descendants of the giants in Gath and were killed by David and his soldiers. Now we'll hear a little bit more about them later on. Some people think that these giants sometimes were supernatural beings, but they wasn't. They were just simply giants. And you have that. We know that today we have people who are 7 feet tall. In other words, it's not uncommon for us to see us. It's not, we see them from time to time. Tall men and women. And so these people were, not only were they tall, in this case, these giants were nearly 9 foot. And so they were extremely large. And then they were bred for war. And so oftentimes they would go out and they would fight. They would go out and they would win battles for the Philistines. Of course, David and his men were anointed by God as better warriors. And so they killed them. All right. We'll pick this up in our next study, chapter 22. David's song. Long chapter, next study. All right, I'll see you then, guys. Don't forget to like and share this video. Hit that subscribe button too. All right, see you guys in the next study.